So with this video, I'm just going to talk a little bit about the relationship between the foreground and the background in your designs, and thinking about ways that you can create interesting background spaces or negative spaces so that what's happening in the foreground becomes more apparent, or just to make the entire design more cohesive. And here are some examples from the week 3 assignments, but I think this kind of idea can apply to all the designs that you do throughout the course. So we see here in this first example that this student has some circular star shapes in the foreground, and she's decided to go with dots in the background. So we still get that circular form in the background. So there's a certain amount of unity between the foreground and the background shapes, but because the background shape doesn't have the star element, it's also adding variety too. So there's unity and variety in the relationship between the foreground and the background shapes in this particular case. Now this student has decided to go with a contrasting shape in the background. In the foreground we only have these organic fluid shapes, but in the background we have these very rigid geometric shapes. And so those rigid geometric shapes enhance the fluidity of the foreground shapes. So that's a great way of using contrast of shape. So this is a good example of that. Now this next example is particularly unusual because the student has decided to put most of her saturated hues in the background shapes. So what's happening is that background is coming forward visually, while the foreground, these muted desaturated shapes, is actually going back visually. So there's a real confusion between positive and negative shape here. And of course there's a lot of contrast in terms of the shapes as well. The foreground shapes are circular and the background shapes are rectangular. And this student has decided to go with diagonal shapes, and here those diagonal shapes add a lot of dynamism to the design, as diagonal lines tend to do, and they contrast very strongly because they're geometric with these very organic shapes in the foreground. But the colours, of course, are from the similar palettes as is the assignment for week 3, assignment 3. And here the student has gone ahead and brought many colours from the foreground and put them in the background, and creating a unified colour sensibility but a very contrasty shape sensibility there. So in both of those designs that's working really well. Now this student has decided to use shapes in the background that are vaguely similar to the shapes in the foreground. So we have these rounded teardrop shapes in the foreground, and we have that rounded aspect happening in the background there. And we can see here that the student has used a subtle, well, perhaps not so subtle blend here of hues, but the shape remains regular throughout. So it's forming a really unified backdrop to the foreground shapes here. And finally, this is a very interesting case of positive and negative switching or flip-flopping here, because this student, at first glance, I feel as though this student has put the green in the background, and we have these circles on top and the stripes on top and so on. But as you look at the design further, you can see that this is also a holly leaf shape. And so that makes this apparently background shape or negative shape positive. So there is this very ambiguous relationship between the positive and negative shapes in this design. And I think that creates a very interesting and engaging design. So that could be something you might want to strive for. Okay, that's all I have. I hope those examples are inspiring for you, and I'm looking forward to seeing some really active and interesting, complex, negative space designs.